appreciate the opportunity to come down from Melbourne and share some of the thinking change that's gone on in Victoria in the last few years. We've faced some very significant hazards. We haven't always been as successful as one would hope in protecting the community, in understanding the complexities of the impacts, the consequences on communities. And when I talk about communities, the loss of 20,000 kilometres of agricultural fencing after Black Saturday. The loss of 20,000 kilometres of agricultural fencing as a result of Black Saturday. The issue to businesses affected in areas affected at risk of threatened landslide after fires along the Great Ocean Road, as traffic had to detour inland to get to major tourist sites, and a very significant hit to the infrastructure economically in local towns along the coast as all those tourists bypassed them. So understanding those sorts of things is critical, and the best way to understand is engagement. There are a significant set of risks that are recognised in the Tasmanian Emergency Management Plan, including hazards such as tsunami and landslip. Biosecurity is a very significant one, as are utility failures. But there are other concerns. We're faced with more novel challenges, we're faced with more everyday challenges, which are sometimes extremely complex, like hazardous materials events, structural building collapse for any cause. The particular photo illustrates a post-earthquake scenario, but it can happen for other reasons, even just a large vehicle impact on a significant building. The challenges that we're faced with cyber terrorism and the ongoing threats of that nature and how pervasive they are, how reliant we're becoming on our smarter technology. Communications independencies early in 2016, Telstra outages affected us nationally across all our capital cities with very significant impacts. Do you realise it's very difficult to buy petrol because your petrol pump relies on Wi-Fi, which is part of your telecommunications? You can't make an EFTPOS payment, and you can't withdraw cash from the ATM. It's much more than smartphones and computers that are challenged in that sort of scenario. What about mass casualty events? Our horrendous, they're not always terrorist, the horrendous drive through the city of Melbourne and the consequences. The consequences that still play out. It's not just the dead, it's not just the injured. All those people who responded, who came out onto the streets from their buildings, the first aid workers, the occ health and safety workers who brought out the automatic defibrillators and the first aid kits and immediately attended to people. A lot of those carry psychological burdens. What care was there back in their own offices from their health and safety teams in an ongoing way? Psychosocial consequences are very significant. They're greater for terrorist incidents, but for anything that involves mutilation or the deaths of children, the impacts are as severe as a terrorist incident. The very apparently random nature of such a criminal act affecting a large number of people is very similar to the issues of terrorism in terms of the psychological impact. The big challenge is that it's not just the people at the scene. They're the people you think of, those and the emergency services workers. But it's all those other people, the people who couldn't reach their family members on that day, who spent hours in an agony of uncertainty, who knew that their family member would be close by. It was lunch hour. So that's a lot of city workers. They may also suffer long-term anxiety and depression, even if they can't pinpoint the reason. It is the single most disabling aspect of emergencies. Understandably, we tend to fall to Hollywood-type images of our expectations of how people behave, of what is normal, when in truth, panic is actually rare. People tend to pro-social behaviours. They run to help. They run towards the problem, not away. They think it through. They carry those first aid kits and those defibrillators to do what they can do within their training. And training is pivotal. You adopt a role, you do your best within that role, you receive however small an acknowledgement of what you have done. It's a very powerful thing psychologically in protecting you from the psychosocial consequences. And whilst we talk about psychological injury, there is also a phenomenon that's increasingly recognised of trauma resilience, of the ability to, whilst having gone through something that you didn't want to, having suffered for a period, of actually growing as an individual, of deepening social connections. There are some positives that are also emerging, so it's not all negative. The critical thing is information is a mental health intervention. Not knowing, uncertainty is an extremely damaging thing. Myths and rumours can fill that space. The ability to actually obtain some credible, authentic, truthful, and as complete as possible information, it goes a long way to addressing uncertainty. It's the importance of understanding where you get credible emergency advice from, and we'll talk a bit more about that, because it provides some structure, some understanding of what's going on. Think of the people in 9/11 fleeing the buildings that collapsed. All they experienced was the noise, the confusion, and blinding dust that was choking their breathing. Were they at war? Was it the end of the world? What exactly had happened? Because they didn't all witness the planes going into the buildings. They didn't all have time to check media or television. They were in it. And for a long time, many of them heard nothing because the Office of Emergency Management of the City of New York was in one of those collapsed buildings. Their staff didn't regroup for 48 hours, although they were in touch with each other via BlackBerry. There are international emergencies, massive human movement. There is chemical warfare underway today in Syria. There are certainly other countries with interest in that area. Not all of it is state level. Some of this is chemicals that are simply accessible. Chlorine's a very common one used to harm crowds of people, suburbs of people. Very accessible, widespread as a purification chemical, particularly for water. Hence the importance and the interest of the Council of Australian Governments in the chemicals of security concern. And I would hope those of you with hazardous materials are aware of that list and the code of practice that's associated with that, and if not, WorkSafe will be able to assist you in that matter. There are bigger global issues. Southeastern Australia has experienced significant impacts that, whilst one incident cannot be attributed to climate change, shows our trend for increasing severity and incidence of natural emergencies. The heat wave in 2014 and the one in 2009, the one in 2009 caused almost twice as many deaths, in fact, in excess of twice as many deaths as Black Saturday. It didn't have a royal commission. That's pretty significant. We accept so many natural hazards as something we can do nothing about. In fact, the state of Victoria was trialling heatwave alerts and community strategies to address heatwave preparedness and actions during the heatwave that they developed in 2009, that they developed further, engaging with a range of bodies, schools, government agencies, businesses, sporting clubs, as well as local councils who were significant leaders in this area, and significantly reduced the impact of mortality and morbidity, hospital attendances too, in the subsequent heat wave, which in fact was longer, so more intense, because you see about a 70% rise in hospital attendances day on day, so compounded over consecutive days of a heat wave. A non-government body led by the Australian Insurance Australia Group, banks and a number of others looked at disaster resilience and the cost to the community. And it's predicted that it will rise another $33 billion per year as we approach 2050. And what are they actually looking at? Well, they think one of the problems economically is that we've tended to count cost. We certainly count cost in lives. And we count cost in direct infrastructure and property damage. But one of the things we don't look at is social disruption, psychological impact, long-term, very significant economic depressants in their own right. Chernobyl caused 37 deaths of responders. There were some 5,000 cases of juvenile thyroid cancer, of which maybe 60 died. That's the number of deaths from Chernobyl. There hasn't been a rise in other sorts of cancer. But nearly 350,000 people were evacuated from the Chernobyl vicinity, many of whom are stigmatised, many of whom lost their jobs, their homes, their villages, their social connections, have higher rates of smoking, drinking, mental distress, and feel that all their health problems, many of which are chronic illness due to their mental and social health, blame it on radiation. It's not attributable to the radiation, it's attributable to the management of the incident and the disruption to lives. There is a clear philosophy of Australian emergency management. And aside from the fact that it needs to consider all the phases, how we prevent, how we mitigate, how we respond to, and how we recover from emergencies, the critical one is that it should be fairly uniform. We should think about a large variety of hazards and as far as possible apply the same principles in thinking to all of them. That the most important part is that it's an integrated approach. We don't do emergency management to the community, we do it with the community. And the community includes a vast array of stakeholders, because the current concept is that we should be building resilience, that people know what to do it for themselves. And this includes what actions. Who here has an understanding of what shelter in place means, or to shelter indoors? That's quite a small number. How many of you have ever been subjected to bushfire smoke? Smoke from a structural fire or a chemical release or fire? It starts to be more significant, and yet we need to understand this. This is a fairly basic concept for protecting your workers. So there are overlaps. None of these things set as discrete entities. And there are things in there that you tend not to think about in emergency management. Land use planning, regulation of hazardous materials. It's a little bit more obvious. Planning effectively needs to be tested. So where do you exercise? Can you exercise reasonably realistically? It's a great challenge there. And recovering. You need not just a plan for the response. It's not over then when the impacts are addressed, but you need to examine the consequences and figure out how you're going to address them. Critical for farmers and rural communities was access to their properties to provide relief to their animals and to check on the welfare, the available feed, injured animals after Black Saturday. Roadblocks because of ongoing fires that continued when they had those concerns in those early days. Their stock could not be left unattended, became flashpoints in those communities between the emergency services workers, particularly the constable manning the roadblock, and the farming community. So we no longer just think of planning, preparedness planning, response and recovery. We need to think about the impact, the direct impact, which area was burnt, but the broader consequences. What does that mean? Which roads are closed? How long will they need to be closed? What is beyond those roads? Will this create isolated communities? The supermarket burnt down. It's 60 kilometres to the next supermarket. What do we do about those people without transport in those communities for getting their groceries? How soon can we get a temporary facility set up? Why should we not provide free groceries to that community? Because that'll leave a whole bunch of people in that community unemployed, or businesses turn up their toes. Thinking it through. So if we think about this, critical to the way we approach is that community is at the centre of everything we do. And stakeholders are very diverse. Researchers were mentioned in Kate's presentation. So academia, non-governmental organisations. Red Cross wants to provide assistance. Volunteers, lobby groups get the ear. Media can present a positive case or a negative case. How do you partner with them? There are endless variety of plans. I'm not going to go through the full scope. These are some of the Commonwealth plans across a range of things. And that's not by any means a comprehensive list. It's a random sample of plans. There are specific plans around national security, something to some extent that we should all be aware of. Just having the number of Crime Stoppers readily accessible so that you can call them when you see something out of place. In each jurisdiction, and in Tasmania too, we follow the National Emergency Risk Assessment Guidelines. Hence, when we were talking about the natural hazards at the start, that informed that process for Tassie. Hopefully most of you will at some point read the Tasmanian Emergency Management Plan. It's written in plain English, not bureaucratese, which is a help. It takes about an hour to read if you dedicate a little time to it. Mind you, I can probably skim through a little faster than most of you because I know the principles. But available from the SES website. sets out quite a bit of information. Although I would say that their recovery plan, at least in the written part of that plan, doesn't mention economic consequences, and that's perhaps something that you could influence or feedback at some point. It would be due for review this year. Characteristics of a disaster resilient community. What makes people resilient is the ability to adapt under stress successfully, that they feel self-reliant and that they understand their integral social capital, their place in the scheme of things, their role, their function. This is important on a personal level, it's important on a business level as well, and an industry level. Particularly having a strong volunteer base, encouraging your workforce to be members of groups like the Fire Service or the SES or St John Ambulance or any other volunteer agency, supporting that, some acknowledgement that that's worthwhile, actually will strengthen your organisational's emergency preparedness. They will have better connections to the emergency services, they will be more familiar with the language used, the expectations, and they will assist you in developing your own preparedness. What about personal resilience? Remember the P's. Your people, your pets or your livestock, the important papers in your life and your phone and the numbers that you need, prescriptions, important bits of plastic. You know, it's kind of debilitating to lose your credit card or your licence and all those other things that these days. From a personal level, photos, having a pack ready to go. What do you need? Well, basically you need some clean clothes and some sturdy boots. And don't forget to be insured. And there are lots of guides that will help you with that. Maintaining situational awareness is critical. TAS Alert and TAS Emergency Information System are the two that are mentioned in the plan. There will be information on a range of media, from radio and television, social media, community meetings, and a host of others. But if you're actively seeking information, probably the most current will be on those two websites. Victoria has something similar. And of course, there's the emergency alert system. I don't know how strong that process is in place, but certainly I got an alert on my phone about the pending heatwave in Melbourne about a week, 10 days ago. So important that you're connected, subscribed if necessary, so that you can get those alerts. I put this in at the very last minute. It's a document I was actually reading this morning, published by the OECD this year on emergency management. And they're addressing very much the nuclear industry worldwide in preparedness, but recognising that the number of incidents in the nuclear industry are actually truly very low, and what they need to learn from is all the other major emergencies that have occurred in OECD countries and how those lessons might adapt. It is important for us all to learn from the lessons of others. Now, Pam, do I have enough time to just run through a couple of interesting public health lessons? Ebola never reached Australia. It did not stop us needing to communicate and reassure with healthcare workers about their level of preparedness. There were deaths, significant numbers of deaths of healthcare workers in West Africa. Why? Because they lived in local villages where people were sick with fever, vomiting, the early symptoms consistent with Ebola, but could have been attributable to dysentery or malaria or any one of a number of other infections. And they tended to, as health professionals, nurse and care for family members and neighbours. They also tended not to necessarily recognise that it was Ebola they were dealing with. They were overworked, working incredibly long hours, and tiredness and fatigue increases your chance of mistakes, and they were under-equipped. All of those circumstances are very different for Australian healthcare workers, but the level of concern and nervousness meant that the efforts that were made, the amount of investment in protective equipment escalated dramatically. Zika virus. Zika virus has in fact been around since 1947. It's probably been around longer, but it was recognised in 1947 in Uganda. And it's done a steady, slow march across Africa, through Southeast Asia, across the Pacific, and reached South America about 2014. Somewhere along the way, it mutated, just enough to cause problems in newborns and neurological problems in adults. Very hard to detect because most people actually don't become unwell. They might get the virus, they can pass it on unwittingly. But of course, this caused an international emergency that the World Health Organization declared. Keeping people informed, healthcare workers, communities, offering reassurance, advising the young in particular, but not only, who travelled to South America, became very important. Being aware that a traveller to those areas could come back and unwittingly infect others, understanding where the mosquito species is that might spread that disease. Well, in Australia we're relatively fortunate, but the far north of Australia is not out of contention. Thunderstorm asthma. 10,000 hospital attendances in 48 hours, 2/3 of which were asthma. More than half of the sufferers had never had asthma in their life. They didn't know what was going on, what to do about it. They had no asthma management plan. They couldn't recognise that it was asthma. They just couldn't breathe. 9 lives were lost. Ambulance service had administrators in vehicles on the road. There were so many calls, many more calls than there were on Black Saturday, which was our previous highest peak, 200. What actually happened was, and the likely culprit is ryegrass pollen, to the west of Melbourne in particular, swept up in the updraft of the thunderstorm, which then fragments the pollen, swells and bursts with the extra moisture in the air, and then gets dumped back on the city in a downdraft. So it has to be the right flowering season for the grass, has to be a thunderstorm in that area, has to dump it on a populated area. Has been documented a few times around the world since 1981, 3 times in Melbourne. Last time had 300 cases of asthma. 10,000. The thing there was recognising what was going on with that novel event. I might just go back a moment. Recognising what was going on with that novel event. Sharing the information with everybody. Government wants to know what's going on. Media wants to know. The hospitals actually recognised what was going on pretty quickly because they had seen it before, although not for a large number of years. So you had to be old, a little bit grey. That helped. But, you know, ambulance, one person even posed, could this be a chemical weapons attack? You know, vast numbers of people in a city can't breathe. How do you address novel things? We had a little fire in a coal mine, you might remember, right beside a city. Town of 14,000 people. Here's the coal mine. Here's the hot spots from the infrared about 48 hours in. And you can see the fires of hell there. When we talk a little coal mine, you know, it's a couple of kilometres deep, open cut, okay? And the smoke, Victoria is very prone to temperature inversions in hot weather, and of course it was hot weather. So the Smoke tended to sag over that population. Now, thank you, Tasmania EPA. They have a mobile vehicle that was able to test air quality and map those, but it was some time before we actually had that advanced equipment, which we now have one of our own, that was able to drive around. And in fact, with the mine here, here's the mapping of how severe the problem was on the edge of the mine, much less severe as you move further away, but not insignificant. The difficulty was what we didn't know. We know a lot about smoke and particles for very short-term exposures. You know, dealing with a structure fire, dealing with a bushfire. You know, it comes, it goes. You have maybe a few days of high-level exposure. Most of us know not to stand in the smoke of the barbecue for the same reason that we'll cough and choke. And we know a lot about ongoing pollution, years and years, and what that means of poor air quality. What we had no information, because there was no precedent, was what happens when people are exposed for a few weeks. How significant are the health effects? And there was no way to provide adequate reassurance. And this was a community, 25% had no access to computers or social media. And of course, the first place that information and warnings went was on the web. This was an area of depressed socioeconomic activity. So their comprehension of the information they got was poor, and it didn't necessarily meet all the questions they had. Trying to tell them that, you know, on a clear day, ventilate your house when you had this much briquette dust on your car outside and building up on your benches on every horizontal surface inside, and as it turned out, in your roof cavity as well. Even though that might not be respirable, it's alarming and threatening. What are the health impacts? This is all over my garden, it's all over the school grounds, it's everywhere. Meeting that challenge is now subject to a 20-year partnership for an academic study in terms to answer that question about what we don't know. And then there was the challenge, of course, a coal mine fire generates a lot of carbon monoxide. So there was not only issues for the workforce, there were issues for the community. And the way to address that was to actually establish community testing centres, so that people who had concerns could wander in and have a quick check and a discussion with a paramedic or a nurse and be referred to their own doctor or to hospital if it was warranted. There were actually very few referrals out. Most people were quite happy to just have a little carboxyhemoglobin test just from a pulse oximeter, which just is a little clamp. Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. That's a fantastic talk. I just wanted to ask you a broad question. Adverse events probably obviously affect emergency management, workplace safety, adverse events in hospitals and wellbeing services, and also in schools and universities. So the principles of planning, collaboration and partnership, which aren't easy and don't come naturally as far as I can understand, and the psychosocial consequences of adverse events and how to achieve trauma resilience. How do we get those more broadly understood across the whole of society? Because they seem to be squirreled away in little bits of in compartments, and I get frustrated. I'm involved in all of those in various hats in all of those spaces, and nobody seems to understand how to collaborate very well, and people don't seem to understand psychosocial consequences or trauma resilience, and planning is kind of just dumb and you do your plan a day, but it doesn't mean anything. Comment on how we can get that those things more broadly understood.
Before 2011, I would say that was true in Victoria, pretty much. Our Emergency Management Commissioner is a visionary. Working with a visionary can be a little painful because he's dragging the whole of the state forward. And it's intense, and it's almost overwhelming at times. But it is changing the way we're approaching things. There is much closer engagement. When he talks of engagement with communities, we no longer think at local government area. There are 72 of those in Victoria. We now knuckle down that sometimes a community is very specific and very isolated. It might be just around a township and the immediate environments around that. It might in fact be a group of similar industries, health, tunnelling industry, etc. He's bringing those on board. Where the Tasmanian Emergency Management Plan has those stakeholders engaged at municipal level, they're engaged at municipal, regional and state level. And it's a flexible model. So if the issue was the mine, we had experts from the mine, we had strong relationships with the health community there. We had to work very differently in terms of collaboration. When we exercised a repeat of the loss of a substation and its impact on telecommunications, and there's one that's critical in Melbourne, which would affect a very wide area of Melbourne. And we know from the loss of one down in Warrnambool due to a fire that we lost personal alert services that Granny uses at home and the ability to call 000 unless you had a particular telecommunications company. When we exercised that, we included all the telecommunications companies as well as AEMO, the Australian Emergency Management Authority, etc. The strategies then for how you effectively... Telstra has had to develop a whole new approach to substation management. So there are a number of terminal substations where a particular community does not get power from two ends or communications from two ends. So now they actually have a portable one that they can move in. Significant challenges. Getting there's not been easy. It's one of the reasons why I include something about personal resilience there. Being adequately trained, having a clear role, understanding what that is, being able to do that without being hampered, and then getting some acknowledgement is a very powerful reinforcement. So we're really talking about end-to-end resilience.